Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's panel session, which is going to focus on the BTD Green Recovery Challenge. My name is Geraldine de Bastian, and I have the honor of moderating the series of panels, which is hosted and produced by the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue. And yes, today we want to focus, as I said, on the winners of the Green Recovery Challenge, which was launched this June, launched with a video inviting young people under the age of 30 to come and share their visions, their ideas on how to implement the Green Deal. And this has been a multi-step process that we're very happy is culminating in this panel session today. It started with people handing in 250-word abstracts that were then reviewed. And out of these abstracts, the 15 most promising were invited to submit a full paper. And these papers were then submitted and read and very kindly judged by our high-level jury, which consisted of different persons of excellence. I would like to give them a shout out and mention them now by name. The high-level jury included Francesco La Camera from the International Renewable Energy Organization IRENA, Ian Campbell from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Javiera Ayudante from the Energy Ministry Chile. If you've been watching this panel series, you will know her from a previous panel we did together. Julia Pattberg from Set Ventures, Kerstin Rock from Pacificorp, Maximilian von Butler from Team Sonnen, and Vaitea Cohen from Enapta. So thanks very much to all those jury members who supported this process. So they all got together and read the submitted papers and selected winners. And it is the 3 winners that received the most points from this process that we're very, very happy to welcome in this panel session today. And what's going to happen in this panel is that we're going to invite each of the winning teams to introduce their paper to you, to give you like a pitch and an overview of what was written in said paper, to do a little interview with the winners, and then we're going to join in a group discussion with the 3 winners winning teams. So with that, I would like to welcome today's panelists and the winners of the Green Recovery Challenge. And the first winners, the people who received the top score of all the papers that were submitted, is a team of 2 authors that I would like to introduce to you now. I am very pleased to introduce to you Tanzin Lonsdale-Smith. She is working as a program officer in the multi-development division at the International Center on Small Hydropower. Hi, Tanzin. It's lovely to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. It's absolutely an honor to be here, and we are super, super happy to have been selected.
Excellent. And so happy to also introduce the second author of this winning team, Rebecca Sands, who is working in content and communication and project manager at Autonomy and the Urban Mobility Summit. Great to meet you, Rebecca, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having us. Really excited to discuss.
And now, of course, I would like to hand the floor over to you to introduce the paper that you wrote, which is, as I said, the winning paper of this competition, and give us a summary of its contents, please.
So in this paper, we presented the problems faced by the Russian Federation and the European Union when it comes to natural gas consumption and infrastructure projects, such as the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The project has faced numerous roadblocks due to international sanctions and lawsuits, and risks becoming a stranded asset if Europe is going to realize its most ambitious climate goals. So natural gas should be largely phased out of the European Union by 2050, and the phase-out process should already be underway by 2030, ideally sooner. Given recent technology advancements in the German industry, biomethane is a very viable replacement for natural gas. And furthermore, the Russian economy has been hard hit by the present and previous oil crises. So for the moment, Russian long-term energy strategy seems to be considering the effects of the climate crisis, and its commitment to climate efforts has been demonstrated with its official ratification of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2019. Still, there are significant technical, political, and financial and institutional barriers that stand in the way of biomethane technology development in the Russian Federation.
So yeah, in the face of these problems, we essentially came up with a comprehensive policy package to facilitate the transition from natural gas to biomethane in the Russian-Europe energy trading system, and to kind of address the barriers of biomethane development in both regions. So this policy package, we kind of broke it up into 4 parts. So the first one would be a short-term agreement to continue purchasing Russian natural gas on the part of the EU, but with caveats. So the purchase must be in decreased quantities in line with decarbonization goals, with EU decarbonization goals, with the aim of, gradually replacing the supply with biomethane. And furthermore, Russian supply of natural gas and biomethane must never surpass the current levels that the EU is importing, which is 40% for security and decarbonization reasons. And then the second part of our package consists of a technology and knowledge exchange platform to be set up between Germany and Russia, which addresses the many barriers to biomethane technology uptake in Russia, and is meant to boost institutional capacity and to be able to carry out the first part of the policy package. And then third, we suggested an offtake agreement to increase the uptake of biomethane upgrading technology at preferential rates and with that exception. And finally, the fourth part of this policy package is a proposal to redirect subsidies in the hope of transferring Russian financing away from fossil fuel subsidies and into biomethane support mechanisms, and as a condition of the agreement. So that's in a nutshell what our proposal was.
Thank you so much. Your proposal makes so much sense. And I'm hesitant. I want to stick on the topic of your paper. Obviously, this has been such a political topic over the last years, but definitely over the last year with all the escalations that we saw. And I'm not going to delve into the very political side of things, because I'm, of course, in fear that many of your very good suggestions be swallowed up by this very geopolitical process. But maybe, is this the key barrier that is being faced, or do you see other barriers that are facing the realization of the suggestions that you brought forth?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I think the geopolitical barrier is a huge one, and probably the biggest one, because it's due to a lot of elements that are way beyond just a proposal like this. So that's definitely part of it. And then I think Tamsin and I discussed a lot about what were the elements that we could add to the proposal to get Russia on board, really. Which is something that we put a lot of thought into, but it's still something that we see as a major barrier, because, as long as the world is continuing to consume natural gas and the EU is continuing to import Russian natural gas, they always stand to win from that situation. So I think that's a big barrier to something like this actually, being possible. And I think another big barrier as well would be just the capacity to be able to implement something like this on the side of Russia, because of the technological, the legal, the regulatory barriers that exist, the political landscape of Russia. Would it actually be possible to implement something as quick as we would like to see it? So I think the fighting against that very institutionalized fossil fuel culture is something that we discussed a lot, and is a barrier for sure.
Yeah, if I could just jump off of that idea, I think that's absolutely one of the biggest points, is that Russia is a very fossil fuel heavy economy. We tried to make the argument that it's really in their benefit to switch to renewable energies in the long term. I think there was an IRENA study that showed that if the Russian Federation were to increase renewable energy capacity by 30%, they could save up to $8 billion per year. So there is an economic incentive to be switching to renewable energies, and it doesn't have to be a barrier, but unfortunately, it is very institutionalized, and there are a lot of high, powerful energy players in the Russian government that unfortunately would try to bury these arguments.
Do you see any leverage points to break open and overcome some of these challenges? Like, what could be the points where one could be convincing in the argument? Like, under which conditions would this be attractive from a Russian perspective, or what could be the selling points?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to kind of latch onto is this idea of existing natural gas infrastructure. That is something that is available in quantity in Russia. Natural gas is such a pinpoint to their economy. So finding a resource such as biomethane and really accelerating that transition is actually, a feasibility study would have to be done to understand where are the feedstock points and how close are they in proximity to this existing infrastructure. But if you can find a certain amount of points that are close enough that the capital expenditure wouldn't be so large to increase this grid connection, then that would not be, it wouldn't be such a negative economic point, I think. And just to highlight one thing, I think there is a national policy in Russia that's already pre-existing since 2016. It's a subsidy for grid connection, and it does cover biogas. And it's a subsidy that can meet up to 70% of the expenditure for a grid connection. So this is a very important thing to highlight, I think, in order to push that argument.
Maybe just as a last question before we move on to the next team, what made you focus on this? Like, obviously being one of the key sort of, things in the, sorry to bad pun, in the pipeline that have made the news big this year. But were there other factors that made you want to focus on this topic in your paper?
Well, I think it was Tamsin that had read a paper on the Swedish biofuels industry, and we had actually previously written another paper on natural gas together, but more as a paper exploring, natural gas as a bridge fuel. So we kind of had this base knowledge together that we had worked on already, and then she had read this paper, talking about the Swedish biofuels industry and how it could possibly, aid in the Russian context. So we just got to talking and we said, okay, yeah, this is super interesting. Let's explore it further. We already have this kind of base knowledge to go off of this work that we've done together. And then, as we started reading, we started reading a lot about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and suddenly I think I sent Tamsin a voice message one day that was like, wait, why don't we just focus on this? This is such a big deal, and the potential is huge, obviously. And
then I was like, yeah, why didn't I think of that before?
Why did we
Great idea.
before?
So it was very organic, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah, and then from there, we started exploring the Swedish biofuels context, and then the more research that we did, we looked into Germany as well, because most of the papers that were talking about biofuels in Europe were also mentioning Germany, and the more we read, the more we decided that it was probably best to focus on the German context. So.
That's also maybe a point that we can dig in a little bit deeper about Germany's role in this complex. And I'd love to hear from all the winners that we've gathered for this panel today, a little bit more about their personal motivation of having joined this challenge when we convene them all as panelists after the individual presentations. But thank you so much, Tamsin and Rebecca, and congratulations to your winning paper. See you both again in a minute. I will now move on to the next winner. The second place in our challenge was won by Maxime Snick, and it's a pleasure to welcome him here as well today. He is Senior Project Manager at Apex Spot. Welcome, Maxime, and congratulations to your winning paper.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Geraldine. So yeah, very happy to present my paper here today and to exchange ideas with the other panelists. So my paper is on the reuse of electric vehicle batteries that have reached the end of their useful life. And the starting point is the intrinsic potential for reuse. And so for that, we need to have a look at the state of the battery at the end of its first life. Typically there we see that a battery from an electric vehicle is end of life when its usable capacity has decreased to 80%. So at this stage, the range of the car will just not be sufficient anymore. However, at this stage, the battery is actually far from waste, because we have several other relevant use cases, such as, for example, stationary energy storage, which have much more relaxed requirements. So for example, in a car, we see that a battery typically needs to be very compact, whereas for stationary energy storage, we have plentiful space. I think, for example, about an industrial site. Also, when we do stationary energy storage, we can typically control the temperature, so it stays within the optimal range of the battery. So we see some clear benefits of reuse, but nonetheless, the majority of the energy companies that invest in flexibility at the moment still choose for new virgin batteries. And there are several reasons for that. The first one is the fact that car manufacturers typically do not want their precious technology to end up in the hands of third parties. The second one is the fact that the current regulatory framework does not encourage reuse at all. To give you a concrete example about that, reuse is not even mentioned in the EU Batteries Directive. And then last but not least, we currently do not have harmonized test methods for establishing the quality of batteries, which is in particular a problem for end-of-life batteries. In the paper, I describe a target regulatory framework that addresses these issues. And I have also proposed the concept of the battery CV, which is a practical tool to standardize the quality assessment of end-of-life batteries. So concretely in this template, we would have a first section with relevant data extracted from the first life of the battery. For example, we can think here about extreme temperature or voltage events, and also about the number of cycles that have been performed. And then in a second part of the CV, we would have, like any good CV, the test scores. And finally, we could also have a quality label that indicates the potential for future use cases. So that's a very short summary of the paper. And maybe as a concluding remark, I would like to mention that the European Commission has proposed last Thursday, so very recently, a new battery regulation where actually a lot of these ideas have been reflected. So we hope sincerely that this text will be adopted soon in its full version with the most ambitious level of objectives. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Maxime. Yes, I was going to ask exactly on this topic. I feel there's a lot of movement and dynamic on the side of regulation, both concretely in relation to batteries, also generally the idea of the right to repair and these concepts becoming more prevalent in European policymaking. So how do you hope to make sure that your ideas feed directly into this process?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we recognize that a battery that is at the end of its life as an electric vehicle battery still has this potential, and we need to make sure that that reuse is actually endorsed as a potential use for the product, and we need to recognize that there is a provider of a second life application. And of course, it's important that that the quality of the battery can be assured, because one of the main concerns with second life batteries is, of course, safety. So therefore, it's really of critical importance that we can have a trustworthy quality assessment.
What other regulatory instruments do you think might be necessary to get there? Like, for instance, should there be differences in taxation for reusable or non-reusable batteries and other incentives like that?
Yeah, we see that at the moment, car manufacturers and who have typically control over the first life of the battery are not really do not really have the incentive to make sure that that the batteries go to second life. And they have, for example, a responsibility, a take-back obligation for the battery until the end of its life. So even if the battery is used for a second life use case, the original manufacturer would actually still be responsible. So that's, of course, a major barrier for reuse. Also, we have the fact that battery packs are really sensitive technology. The competition between car manufacturers is really happening on the battery technology. So they are quite reluctant to transfer that critical technology to third parties. So I think we should really have sort of enforcement and opening of this battery technology, making sure that that the battery management system can be accessed, and that car manufacturers also can easily transfer the responsibility of the battery pack to third parties.
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like from a consumer perspective, this is all a crazy jungle that nobody understands. I mean, I'm just saying this with a very low expert level of knowledge myself, but just having followed conversations in Germany as the government was trying to promote the sales of electric vehicles and all the confusions that go in about, do I even own the battery in my car? How can I, what can I do with a battery in my car, are so big that there needs to be sort of a translation service of why this is necessary in order for consumers also to raise the pressure on this topic. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's indeed very important that we have clear ownership over the battery, and also traceability. I think will be very important. So we need to know, we need to be able to really know exactly what a battery has been doing throughout its whole lifetime.
Yeah, which is where the idea of the CV is a kind of very nice
Indeed,
idea,
yeah.
I think. Maybe just a last question before we move on to the third presentation. Maxime, is this something that you deal with on your everyday base in your day job, or how did you get interested in writing a paper on the future second life of batteries?
Well, I've actually launched a startup recently that wants to offer grid balancing services through second life batteries. So we have basically drawn from first-hand experience, and we have noticed that it's quite difficult to obtain end-of-life EV batteries. And this paper is a bit the fruit of the work that we have been doing on the last in the last few months.
Maybe we will meet again at the Startups Energy and Transition Award next year. So that's very exciting to hear. Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation, and look forward to rejoining in conversation in a minute. But now we'd like to move on to hear the third presentation of the third winner. Third place is, I'm very happy to introduce now Simon Anderson from Melbourne. Simon Anderson from Melbourne. Simon is a senior mechanical engineer at Renewables AGL Energy. And thanks so much for overcoming all time barriers and being with us now, Simon. It's lovely to have you, and congratulations for your paper.
Thank you very much, and it's great to dial in from Melbourne, Australia. I do have sort of a bit of an interesting background being a mechanical engineer, but I do have an undergraduate in law and have recently finished a master's in energy and resource law, and hence the submission of my paper. So thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for your paper, which is very inspiring and quite philosophical in places. Maybe you can introduce it to us now, please.
No problem. So my paper is, I guess, more of a policy type approach and has more of a high level look on the green recovery. In particular, it focuses on this idea of degrowth and a new look into sustainable development. And really the idea is viewing sustainability and development through a different lens. And often in particular, this is kind of almost separating the concepts of sustainability and development, which can sometimes conflict with each other. But in particular, it's really separating GDP from environmental measures, which can often blur the nature of that sustainable growth. The concept of the paper is to really challenge the myth of decoupling and energy efficiency. These are concepts that are often really used to justify growth and GDP, but they can really kind of blur the message of making that sustainable. Often those concepts you have relative and absolute decoupling, but often in general, those are both just myths and supporting this sort of message of continuous growth and not really focusing on the key sustainability message, which is to really reduce resource consumption, which is kind of my main focus area. I think these concepts really end up resulting in some of the facts and figures and outlooks. They increase what's called a rebound effect, where you increase efficiency and all those other concepts. It increases resource use and consumption. So yeah, the real target of the paper is to focus on minimizing an absolute resource consumption and energy usage, really targeting sort of key extractive industries, which are really difficult to curtail emissions. So coming back, I guess, to the first paper on the natural gas usage, it's really related to that in terms of being able to really track, monitor, and set some standards on resource use and consumption. So I guess the key issues throughout the paper that I discuss, as I mentioned, sort of increases in GDP are often seen as essential for development. These efficiency measures are then used to justify the increases in GDP and resource extraction. Often efficiency measures are seen as being really good, but at the end of the day, if you're using more and more resources, it doesn't matter how efficiently you're using them. You know, and there's a key relationship between sort of those resource intensive countries and emissions and emission policies. I mean, it's no sort of no misunderstanding that Australia's probably one of the poor performers in the world in terms of emission policies. We're also one of the largest contributors to those extractive industries. So it's about how we change that around and how we maneuver around that. And the other key thing is, you know, often decoupling is seen as the key solution. And there's, you know, quite a number of studies and support from the United Nations Environment Programme, the International Resource Panel of supporting this concept. But at the end of the day, I sort of push the idea where it's really masking, I guess, an idea that hasn't really had any results. So we kind of need to move on and think a bit differently. Throughout my paper, I assess different countries and different approaches. Obviously, Australia, where I'm from, it's very much a kind of really trying to push production and new technology rather than taxes, opening up the free market, which has really struggled to gain any traction in terms of emission reductions. You know, comparing that to other countries that are still developed, such as Germany, which has had some really decent policies in terms of minimising or prohibiting sort of hard coal mines and things like that. So that's kind of a relative decoupling, but at the end of the day, they are importing a lot of natural gas, as was discussed in the first paper. So there's still that resource use, and we need to be careful of masking those things. And then, you know, looking at other alternatives to addressing this in things like Norway, which has a sovereign wealth fund, which is, you know, really taking funds out of these extractive resources and putting them in better places. So in terms of the path forward that I propose, we really need to track and measure, I guess, these key indicators better, particularly from absolute resource use and consumption, absolute energy consumption, rather than just trying to look at emissions, you know, within a country and other things like that. We need to look at where the source of these emissions are coming from, and often it's really big extractive industries. Other things, we need leadership, you know, within different countries. There needs to be a social acceptance of this transition. You know, it's quite difficult to close these industries and to kind of move back, because often they're tied to GDP and development, and often that's seen as necessary. Yeah, and just in terms of policy development, you know, we need sort of more taxes or more funding to support these industries to transition. You know, we need to focus on more local orientated things rather than trying to increase production and increase exports. And yeah, apart from that, it's sort of, yeah, we just need to kind of track absolute measures rather than efficiencies and sort of those indicators which are sort of hiding the extractive industries.
Thank you very much. Allow me if we begin a little bit general our conversation, but I'm wondering what your personal take is, because there's been so much discussion in the last months how the pandemic is going to work out in terms of accelerating the ideas that you've also dealt with in your paper and having us understand that there are more important things in this world life and working in favor of these concepts of degrowth. And both radical change in consumption as well as some production mechanisms, which is of course also a big discussion going on, also under the term decoupling, but maybe in a different with a different connotation when it comes to replanning our supply chains, etc. Or if you are in the fraction of people who believe this is going in the opposite direction, we're going to have this huge backlash caused by the pandemic, and that all these conversations will be even harder to have.
Yeah, I think, well, the pandemic's almost forcing us to do it and forcing us to be more local with our sort of resource use. And, you know, it's really put a stranglehold on the extractive industries as production's really slowed. So, you know, I think this is the real opportunity in real time to kind of grow new ideas and new things. And I guess an example of that is maybe rooftop solar in Australia. That's kind of a real consumer-based driven initiative, and that's something that everyone can access. It's highly localized. It really reduces the need to depend on those centralized coal-fired assets, and it's really resulting in a great outcome. And when we talk about degrowth as well, I sort of want to paint it as a picture where it's not kind of this hippie idea of not having a good lifestyle. It's I mean, degrowth is happening in the electricity grid and the main electricity grids due to these decentralized energy sources, and that's something that's a real challenge moving forward, but a real opportunity in something like a pandemic. And on other levels, we're going to local markets, local food shops. We can't go very far. We're not traveling very far. So, I've worked in the oil and gas industry for a couple of years in a previous life almost, and that industry is really struggling. So, there's a real opportunity to take advantage of these other sort of energy sources.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you're on the hopeful side of things. Maybe one more question in the sort of more philosophical category. You speak of sustainable green growth, and I'm wondering if you've considered concepts like the ones being expressed by groups like XR, that sustainability is no longer enough, but we need to think about regenerative, I'll say, growth or regenerative ways of organizing our economy. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's almost like we just need to be harder on ourselves, and we need to be harder on our economies. And I think it's kind of a time to not even talk about growth differently, where it's not just GDP, it's other measures of lifestyle choices and other things like that, health and well-being, which does sort of get away from that GDP obsession. And I think the problem is, and the main problem I sort of wrote this paper was because a lot of countries find themselves really attached to this GDP thing and want to get lots of resources and extract them and make lots of money, but they end up getting used by these larger companies that have no interest in the country. And that's what we saw in Australia. And I think these larger companies, even though it is a developed country, has had that issue, and now Australia doesn't have the wealth funds that Norway has to develop itself. So yeah, it's got to sort of find other ways and other means, and we just need to be harder on our economies and accept that. And that's the hardest thing, social acceptance.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe also where there's one connection point between the three papers that were presented now, which is that it's very apparent that the stronghold of very powerful corporations with a lot of lobby power are putting the brakes on the movement, whether that's in relation to the first paper that was presented on biomethane as an opportunity for market participation in Russia, or the topic of battery second life, or the topic that you've just presented. So let's bring everybody back together who presented and join maybe in a little bit of a discussion. I mean, what I've just said is a kind of obvious thing, that's no news, that the power of big corporations is something that's limited perhaps the effects that we'd like to see coming from the renewable energy sector. I would like to just sort of acknowledge, and again, thank you all for your fantastic papers and contributions that you wrote. I think it's also exciting to see that there are three, of course, topics that belong to the same puzzle, as in pieces to a different picture, but really deal with very different aspects of the spectrum. So I'm glad that we were able to cover such diversity. So I want to, ask a couple of questions to see maybe a little bit the common thread between them, and then find out a little bit more about you personally before we end the panel discussion. We've already talked individually a little bit where we see the momentum right now, and especially looking that, this whole new Green Deal legislature there's really a push in these different aspects of of the sector that we've talked about today, whether it's the legislation that's going to be proposed next year for supply chain management, battery legislation that was just mentioned, the right to repair that I mentioned earlier, or other aspects. How hopeful are you, and what are your expectations looking into 2021, how these ideas that you're bringing forward can actually gain traction and become policies in Europe, but also beyond? An open question to all of you.
If talking about the Green New Deal and the different aspects of the Green New Deal that could potentially make me feel hopeful about my idea or any other idea, I think we touched upon this a little bit in our paper, but the proposed climate law, I think, is something that makes me feel hopeful in general about the coming years, about the monstrous effort that must be put into decarbonizing, the EU's economy. And I think the climate law allows for a good way to do that, because it allows each country to be able to determine its own path forward. But there's quite a lot of checks and balances in terms of strategies that must be put forward, 5-year checks, that type of thing. So I think in terms of elements of the Green New Deal, that's something that makes me feel really hopeful. In terms of our proposal in general, I think it was quite ambitious. And, as we already discussed, something geopolitically that's probably way beyond our ability to do anything about. But as long as the policy is there, the policy is the first step, obviously. And as long as there's ambitious policy, then it paves the way for anything else that might be able to come. So the more strong that can be coming into 2021, obviously, the more opportunities there are out there.
Thank you.
Tamsin, I don't know if you want to add to
Thank
that.
you, Rebecca. Yeah, does anybody else want to add? Tamsin, I thought you looked like you wanted to say something.
The only thing that really came to mind was the proposed EU border carbon tax. This is more, I'm not sure how to link this specifically to each one of our proposals, but as a broad policy initiative, I think it's a very promising thing in the future that will be pushing the private sector towards more carbon unintensive trade.
Yes, thank you. Any other additions?
Yeah, I think maybe just as mentioned before, I guess just with the current conditions we have, we're using less resources, and Australia has been quite exposed recently with its trade deals with China and other places like that. It has been so reliant on these external countries for so long with just exporting, and to that extent, we've been a lucky country. So, I think Australia doesn't have really strong policies, but is sort of being found out quite quickly without them that it will struggle, and it has recently been sort of reasonably shut off because of its climate policies from other sort of climate change talks and conferences. So I mean, yeah, the sort of movement is happening, and the movement is there, and there's building pressure for that, which is good to see.
Absolutely. Maxime?
Yeah, I wanted to add that as for the scope of my paper, so the reuse of batteries from electric vehicles, I also thought the paper was quite ambitious, but I was really happy to see that the regulation that is proposed by the European Commission actually addresses most of what I've proposed. So I am quite optimistic in that sense. The only thing that is maybe a bit disappointing is that in the regulation, the targets are still open for interpretation. So there are different levels of ambition that are proposed, and also the timeline is maybe a bit, maybe too far ahead of us. So the battery passport that has been proposed in the regulation should only be implemented as of 2026. So that's maybe a bit could have been a bit sooner. But I'm quite optimistic, at least for this domain.
It's excellent to hear. It's been a very hard year, and these topics are not always very easy to discuss in an optimistic sense. So it's good to hear what you're hopeful about for next year. I would, before we close, just like to find out a little bit more about how you all managed to write these fantastic papers next to the other things that you do. How did you find out about this challenge? Were you always scanning the website, BETD? Did a friend tell you about this? Did it just come up in your work life? How did we get to enjoy you partaking in this competition?
So I used to be employed by REN21, the Renewable Energy Network for the 21st Century, and they actually shared the opportunity with me through an email. So that's when I immediately saw this opportunity, thought of the idea, and immediately called Rebecca and our other teammate who wrote the previous paper on natural gas with us. And yeah, it was a bit of an impulsive decision. I was like, I want to do this. Are you guys on board? And thankfully, Rebecca said yes. And
excellent. Very good impulse.
yes.
How about the others? How did you find out about this?
To be honest, I can't remember. I think it just appeared somewhere in my LinkedIn or Google. Yeah, smart advertising, I guess.
And how about you, Simon?
Just through links with Melbourne University, actually. So Melbourne University actually has some pretty close links with a German sort of climate change institute. And, you know, as Australia, we're always looking up to Germany. And I've recently just finished my master's, and I'm really keen to kind of continue discussions. And yeah, just conveniently had a paper which worked out. So yeah, glad it did.
Fantastic. And maybe, Maxime, feel free to share again. You have a startup working on this topic, and maybe if the others also have things that you would like to share and watch this space, and these are themes and topics I'm going to be working on, then here's your chance to plug them. You can go first, Maxime.
Yeah, so I already mentioned that we are trying to develop grid balancing services, and we think it's absolutely stupid to use virgin new batteries for this purpose, because as you might have heard, there will be a real boom in electric vehicles in the coming years, and we have at least 200 models that have been announced by car manufacturers for the coming years. Some of the big ones even have completely phased out their traditional combustion vehicles. So it's almost a certainty that there will be this massive offer of lithium-ion batteries. So yeah, why not make use of it? It would be really a pity. And this is a bit the idea is to activate them for another important aspect of the energy transition, which is flexibility in the electricity system.
Excellent. Wishing you all the best with that, and looking forward to seeing how that was going to develop. Tamsin, Rebecca, do you have something you want to share or plug?
Not on my side, but I don't know if Rebecca, do you have anything?
No, I mean, this was definitely a kind of passion project. We just did it, you know, in our spare time after our day jobs were finished, you know, in the evenings and in the late nights. But you know, in terms of the project itself, if anyone is interested in, you know, hearing more about it, or, you know, working on something related to it, or wants to find out more information, of course, I think we're both free and very willing to continue the discussion with whoever is interested. So call us.
Excellent. I have something
Absolutely.
to plug on your behalf as well, which is that BETD is very much looking forward to doing another panel with the two of you being the winning team in this challenge in 2021. So we'll definitely be hearing more from you in that context as well, and look forward to that. Simon, you've already said you're going to keep working on this topic academically as well. As practically, is there anything you'd like to share, something to watch out for?
Nothing in particular, but yeah, I guess I work for AGL is Australian Gas and Lighting. It's Australia's largest electricity retailer, and you know, we're currently looking to grow our wind and solar portfolio, and then also batteries. So maybe I just need to follow Maxime, because yeah, we're looking for a lot of sort of yeah, grid stability kind of battery input into our grid at the moment. And even from a retailing point of view, with a lot of people buying electric cars, working out how we can connect them back into the grid and make them more dynamic and beneficial for customers. So yeah, maybe I just need to follow Maxime.
Always good to create some cross synergies between panelists and collaborators within a competition. So I hope that's exactly the sentiment that we can leave with. Of course, that's also the idea behind hosting something like this, not just to create competing papers, but hopefully new collaborations amongst the people who participated. I'd like to thank you all so much, not just for joining today's panel session, but also really for taking your time to write such incredible papers with such great policy recommendations, and hopefully on the sentiment of looking forward to seeing things come be into life, be implemented in 2021. We'll see many of your fantastic ideas turn into practice. So thank you very much, and congratulations again to all of you.